Welcome to the Storytellers, the radio show and podcast that features those who choose to leave their mark on the world through the art of story. I'm your host, Grace Sammon. I look forward to our time together today. Now, let's meet our storyteller. Angela Cairns is a double business owner, a BBC broadcaster, and of interest to our listeners today, a storyteller who is an Amazon bestseller. I'm so excited to welcome from the United Kingdom, Angela Cairns. Welcome.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm so thrilled that you could come. You have such a fascinating story, but I want to start out right at the very beginning. Why storytelling? You've been a business owner, you're a coach. Why storytelling?
I've always loved telling stories, and I guess I started storytelling I'm a physiotherapist, acupuncturist, and so I do a lot of relaxation work with patients, and I started off telling relaxation stories, and then I recorded those. When I was at the BBC, I bumped into a local composer, and I said to him, I don't suppose you'd be interested in soundtracking these. So we worked together and we produced a series of relaxation visualizations with sort of movie type immersive soundtracks. And we used a lot of musical techniques to make them immersive as well. And that's where I started telling stories. But I knew that I wanted to write a book. And I think the trigger for me, I lost a young friend to a very aggressive brain tumor, came out of the blue. And I think it really hit home to me that we just don't know how much time we have. And therefore, that really spurred me on to look for a writing group and to start my writing. Yeah.
Well, that brings me right to my next thought about you and your work. One of your taglines I absolutely loved. It's every new start begins with an end. So you had a friend with a very aggressive brain tumor, and talk a little bit about embracing that every new start begins with an end.
Okay, so this is in part the story of the main character, Ellie Rose, in the story, in that she has a very happy, fulfilled life laid out for her. She has a lot of plans, and then an unexpected bereavement changes all that, and she has to look at her life. She relocates and she finds the resilience to set up a new life. And okay, that's one thing, that's a bereavement, and that was one of the things that influenced me. But I feel that for people in general, very often who knows what's good and what's bad? And sometimes things happen to us. We have an outcome in mind that gets changed and it feels like a catastrophe at the time. And yet out of it grows self-knowledge, an opportunity, a gift of some kind that takes us in a new direction. And looking back, whilst we don't relish the experience, it nonetheless sets us off into a pattern that perhaps we wouldn't otherwise have done. And it helps us to find new depths in ourselves. It helps us to find souls who are compatible with us, and support comes from all sorts of unusual places that we don't really expect it to come from sometimes. And sometimes it doesn't come from places we think it would. And I'm fascinated by those relationships and what helps us to grow and to develop. So I think those are fascinating relationships.
Is that a theme of all of your writing then?
Well, it's a theme of that first series, definitely. But I think it's a theme of life in general. And I'm particularly interested in how the social and economic times influence the lives of women. So social, political, economic times, they've influenced the lives of men and women, but I'm particularly interested in the role of women, and their growth and development. And I think those friendships and that found family is so very important.
And you have, I believe, 5 books out. You're an Amazon bestseller. I want to talk about that, but you have a brand new book coming out very soon, A Song for Kitty. Tell us about it.
Oh, A Song for Kitty is, I've dedicated it to my grandmother. She was born in 1896, and she lived till she was 106. So I knew her well, and I knew a lot about her life in that pre-First World War time. And it was a fascinating time. I was also fascinated by how fashions were changing at that time, and how they allowed the change in the design of clothing for women, allowed them access to activities that previously had been restricted for them. The arrival of the First World War obviously allowed some of them access to a working career that they didn't have previously. So it's an absolutely fascinating time, and it tells the story of it's a romance, but it's set in the factually, historically, it's I've delved into that a huge amount, and it's looking at the lives of two young people and how their life develops and how their relationship moves forward under that sort of pressure cooker of that economic time.
So this is historical fiction. You just uh, spurned me on to ask a question. You said the dresses changed access to certain
Mm,
activities. Could you
yeah.
give us an example?
Yes. Well, Coco Chanel, for example, was a young dressmaker just before the First World War. And she started to design dresses that could be worn without corsets. And they also had, they were above the ankle. So that, and she also designed dresses with divided skirts. So they were like culottes. So women could actually play sport that they weren't playing before. And without the corsetry, they could actually breathe, so they could move fast and they could bend and so on. Now, I'm a physio, so I can, for me, those fashions where women's were tightly corseted, I can just imagine the impact that had on their fitness and their ability to breathe, to move fast. And if you can't breathe well, you're not getting a good blood supply. So your decision making, your concentration are all impacted. Now, as I say, in that just pre-World War, we started to get a real change in women's fashion. And that gave them access to all sorts of things they hadn't had before.
Let's switch a little bit to genre because here we just talked about your new book, A Song for Kitty, and
Mm.
that's historical fiction with some romance in it. Your
Hmm.
other your other books are a series,
Yeah.
and they're classified as women's fiction. And here in the US, there's a big debate about what is women's fiction as a genre. So tell us what the debate is in the UK,
Mm.
if there is one.
So, yeah. Um, I don't, well, there is a debate going on about that because I was speaking to a crime writer who said, well, lots of women read my books and they're fiction, so they're women's fiction. And I think that the romance genre is fairly well defined, and it has an expectation of the design of the book. And there are different facets within romance. There's fantasy romance, and there's paranormal and so on. But they have a sort of an arc, a story arc in them. And for me, I think where women's fiction came in was that it looked at it had other issues that were debated. So there might be issues, political issues, issues about women's rights or about human rights, maybe gender issues. And So if there was a romantic theme, which there often is, um, it was alongside a, another theme or themes that were debated.
Yeah, here in the United States, the arc is that the female character has to have huge change in personality, you know,
Mhm.
a change within not her personality, but within her outcomes. There has to be
Yeah,
something that she resolves to become a better
yeah,
person, if you will,
yeah,
or resolve
yeah,
things that help her grow. And
yeah,
it is interesting. I'm a member of the Women's Fiction Writers Association, so
yeah.
it's
Me
been
too.
yeah, so it's been interesting to watch that debate just a little bit. So you've written a standalone, you've written series. How do you
Mhm.
feel about each? And how do you know when it's going to be a series versus a standalone?
Okay, so the series, I knew at the start it was going to be a series because I wanted to carry her life through. I wanted to start at this point. I wanted us to see her resolve this issue, and then I wanted to see her move on in her life, and because she starts off in her 20s. So there are so many changes in her life. How she runs her career, how she looks at confronting whether she's going to have a family or not, whether how that will fit in with her career, how she relates to her friends, how her marriage works. So, all those things to be talked about as she moves through and as the characters mature and develop. So I knew that I wanted a series on that book. And because I'm a physiotherapist, I had a real passion to talk about some health and wellness issues that I wanted to discuss. There's a in the UK, certainly, we've got a little bit sidetracked about focusing on people's health, and we maybe don't concentrate enough on their well-being. But I worked quite a lot in Europe, and there's a big emphasis in healthcare on people's wellness and well-being. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And I also wanted to talk about some of the holistic therapies that I think are not that are complementary to conventional medicine as opposed to alternative to. So there were some issues I had that I wanted to talk about in that series as well.
So you were able to bring your corporate life and then your
Yeah,
writing life together. So
together.
yes,
Mm,
so you had what many authors would dream about. In 2019, you found an
yes,
agent wanted to work with you,
yes.
and then there was a
And then,
process, and
yeah,
then there was a process. And I've seen that many times in the United States, and I've been published traditionally, hybrid, and independently. So I'd love to hear about your wonderful experience of finding an agent and then what really happened with your stories.
yeah. So I was very excited. I met an agent at it was a writing day, a conference day, and I'd been submitting to agents, and we had been invited on that day to submit 3 chapters, and some would be picked for critique. And mine actually got picked for critique, and the agent subsequently approached me and said she would like to read the whole manuscript, and accepted it, and was offered a contract. So I was very excited about this, and I didn't really know what I expected, but I was given quite a short deadline to produce a second book, which I met, and then it just all went quiet, and I didn't get a critique back on that second text, and it just sat, and in the end, it all just sat for about 9 months, and there didn't seem to be any urgency whatsoever. Um, and then I got asked a deadline for a third book, and I thought, do you know what? I'm not too happy about this, and I own my own business. I manage 2 healthcare clinics, and I just thought I have transferable skills here, and I'd been reading a lot about the self-publishing world. I'd been to conferences and so on, and I thought, I have some of these skills, and I started writing relatively late, and I don't want my books to be posthumous, basically. I want them to see them out there.
Oh, I love that.
So, so I spoke to my agent and I said, look, I think I'm going to take my series and I'm going to go alone. And she was, she was very reasonable about that, but was very interested in the historical fiction. And then again, it kind of went quiet. And I thought, I'm having to work too hard at this relationship. So yeah, I brought my books out. I did a lot. It's a lot of work. It's a steep learning curve. It took me a while to get my street team together, my editor and my cover designer and my proofreader. I made mistakes, and I had to correct on that first book. And then I re-released with a new cover, and I'd edited and so on, and that's when I had my bestseller. And I'd learned also about the book marketing, which you have to wear many hats as a self-published author, and you need a good street team, and that, like any business, it takes time for that to grow.
Well, I love that part of the story because, as I said, so many of us would cherish being agented, but it doesn't always work out. And
Yeah,
this really goes back to your other theme of at the very beginning where we were talking about, tomorrow isn't promised. We don't know how much time we have. And I think particularly for authors of a certain age, we
yeah.
want our books out in the world, and it takes so much work to do that. So I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the mistakes you made, and then what made it a bestseller, though. Obviously, it's wonderful writing and it's a series, but do you have some secrets both on the boy, don't do this, and please make sure you do that part?
Mm. So, so I think if you want to have your best, if you want to have a bestseller, then you have to have a launch campaign, and your launch campaign starts well before the book's published. So you have to engage with social media, you have to engage with speaking on podcasts and so on. So you have to begin to excite people about the prospect of this book coming. And then I'm a real believer that on that launch weekend, you have to have book promotions stacked. And the method I used was to use initially free book promotions, and then to bring in some lower price book promotions, and then for the book to go to its full price alongside my speaking engagements. And the other thing, I think authors, you have to have an email list. You have to have a tribe of people who love your work, and who will put that message out for you as well. And that involves, I think, again, a lot of back work. I think it involves a bit of gifting your work, so that people, if you have a novella or a prequel, that you can become involved with cooperative promotions with other authors, so that you share your list with them and they share their list with you, so that you have multiple lists that you can then access. So it's really important to have joint ventures with other authors. I don't think you can do it if you're an island. Yeah, so
I
that's it. It wasn't really sorcery, it was just a planned campaign.
Well, and I think you speak certainly to the wearing of the many hats, but if there was something that surprised me most in becoming a novelist versus the nonfiction writing that I did, it is truly that it takes a village and we have to be so
Mm,
collaborative.
mm,
So,
yes,
um, I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to have you on the show, Angela. I want people to look for your series, but also for your new book, A Song for Kitty.
thank
Particularly, you
you.
have just such a wonderful stance for the things that impact women. So I'm so glad that you're here today on the Storytellers.
Thank you so much. It's been fun to chat.
It's been great. This has been a copyrighted episode of The Storytellers by Grace Sammon and Authors on the Air, Global Radio Network. That concludes this episode of The Storytellers. I'm so glad you could be part of the story today. I hope you share the stories, tell your own, and come back for another episode, because when our stories are told, everything changes. I'm Grace Sammon.